Hi, welcome to the first of our weekly lectures in world religions. We're going to go over chapter 1 today, which is basically the study of religions. What I want to get across in doing these is basically helping you to just go through the book and see the things that are important. There's literally going to be very little here that if you've read the book closely, you're going to get that much more out of probably, but there are a lot of people who get a good deal of studying done by listening to the professor talk about the stuff they've already read in the text or listening to the professor talk about the stuff they're going to read in the text. So I didn't want to lose that aspect of being able to be live and in person. So I'm just going to go through this PowerPoint that I'll put up later for y'all to have access to, and give you a few of my thoughts about these subjects. Okay, so in chapter 1, we're concerned about the study of religion more than anything else. So the first thing we're going to do with sacred traditions is try to come up with an idea about, how we gather information concerning sacred practices, sacred traditions, and of course, in the world where people are alive practicing a particular religion, like, most all of the religions that we call the great religions have practitioners in almost every country. Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Confucianism. You can find people who practice this religion to some degree or not, just almost everywhere in the world. But then, of course, there's also still local tribal or local indigenous religions, which is the reason why we're starting off after this first chapter by looking at the religious practices of First Nations or Native Americans here in the two Americas, the Western Hemisphere, and then go back over to Africa to look at the beliefs and practices of the people in Africa who have kept their traditional sacred traditions. Okay, so we have people who are alive, contemporary people who practice the sacred tradition. We also have the historical record. That's good not only for getting a better idea about people who are in the so-called great religions, which are almost all literary in some fashion, right? There's always some kind, like, considering how old they are and how long they've been around in cultures that are literate cultures, there's lots of sacred writing, all kinds of other records. There's all the artwork, primarily the artwork that we uncover from the ancients is religious artwork in some fashion. Sometimes it'll be, honoring a famous person from that people, but generally the artwork is very much more oriented towards the sacred traditions of a certain ethnicity. We find the other artifacts. So, between the sacred writing and then doing archaeology, if we want that first picture that I showed y'all there was that's here. That's actually Dionysius, the god of ecstasy and wine in ancient Greece, and it was out of his cult that the theater was born, actually. So through archaeology, we can go back and learn a lot about Dionysius, but despite the fact that there are probably people nowadays who would say they're followers of Dionysius, there are no extant cults of Dionysius. So we use archaeology to go back and try to figure out everything we can, especially since these kinds of religious practices that we call ecstatic or practices of ecstasy are happenings that don't get recorded, except, people say, oh, everybody became very ecstatic and they were jumping around and they were doing this, or they were inspired to run around and, cut flowers, or they were inspired to run around and, attack non-believers, whatever the case may be. There might be a few of these written recordings of stuff like that, but on the whole, we have to use archaeological digs to go into these sacred places and find things like the remains of sacrifices or ritual equipment or things like that. So first we want to actually think about what the common features of religions are, and obviously, especially if you've grown up in or around the Abrahamic traditions, you automatically default to believing that all religions have a god or gods. But definitely we can say that all religions have what we might call extraordinary forces, which can be called spirits or ancestors or gods. And it is the case that if you look at the written record of the Greek civilization and Roman civilization, the Chinese, diverse civilizations in the Middle East and India and Africa, when you look at what is recorded about those practices in those times, throughout all of that, you get this idea that everything in the world is alive, that everything has its own spirit or whatever. So Edward Tyler theorized that religion actually begins out of first having this idea that our ordinary world is a world where everything is alive, right? So for this idea of from Tyler, that all people in the beginnings of their spiritual paths develop the notion that there is extraordinary amount of life. And so, as we say here, the earth and everything in it has an anima or a spirit. And, if you actually talk to anybody who loves to go out hiking or camping, or who loves to go rock climbing, or who loves to garden, or is just in love with their pets, you see them making use, bringing nature into their lives and holding it as sacred, holding all the things that are there, even the rocks in their gardens that have some sort of spiritual force. So this is not something that just goes away, right? And so these, what we might call inorganic things like rocks and large temple complexes, things like that, or these things that we would call, these living things, it's organic, animals, plants, groups of them, forests, or, sacred hillocks, things like that. They contain power. And that's really, in one sense, what is being exchanged with, right? If you look at a rock, a big boulder, say, on campus, it's there mostly for decoration, but if you really just pay attention to it, you see that it has this stillness to it that's almost worth copying. It has this patience, right? So, obviously I'm anthropomorphizing the rock to a certain extent. That's what some people would say. But in all reality, the idea is that sacred tradition always reconnects us in some fashion back to physical reality, even when it's talking constantly about another world, right? About getting to heaven or getting to paradise. It's still always regrounding us back in the nature that we find ourselves in. Also, among all the people that we know in our lives and the things that we do in our lives, we come to hold ancestors in some high regard. And there are some people who believe that ancestor veneration is actually what leads to the veneration of gods or heroes, because somebody who is really important in a particular family or a particular community gets remembered, and then they keep being remembered generations after they were alive, until finally they turn into a sort of sky spirit or sort of guardian spirit. Um, and we still do this. This is a picture here that you're seeing is a picture of me with my mom about 4 years ago. I do this with all the people in my family who've passed away. She passed away last October, and all the people in my family who've passed away, I have a special little couple of spots in my house where I put their pictures, where I have mementos they gave me, and I find myself talking to my mother and my brother and my father, who are all passed away now. And aunts, my mentor, Professor Owsley, I talk to them. I interact with them. Now, do I think that do I know they hear me? Do I know that they're no? Of course not. This is one of these things that we actually still kind of keep alive, this notion of the ancestors who protect us, out of a kind of faith or veneration, right? That we're still an extenuation of them, so they have a vested interest in helping us. And they're the origin of us, so we have a vested interest in keeping their memory alive. Uh, Now, inside of all of this, some of these people, these ancestors who go on to become heroes, and then from there maybe go on to become demigods or gods, uh, we tell narratives. And the Greek word for narrative is myth. Right? So a myth is not a lie. A myth is not something that's untrue. A myth is a narrative we tell in which we attempt to give some kind of, in a sense, some kind of knowledge about the world, and about our place in the world, right? So myths are situating constructs. They help us sort of situate ourselves inside of a larger story, right? So all sacred traditions have these narratives, have this mythology, right? So it's one of the things we do when we study the artworks and the written records and the archaeological finds of any religion, or really any aspect of an ancient people, is we look to see what kind of narratives begin to develop, narratives that we can still see, narratives that we can get a hold of and take a look at and think about. We also develop rituals. Now, again, I said in the first meeting, if you were there for it, or if you listened to the recording later, I said that that religion actually comes from a Latin word, religio. It comes from a Latin word, and that word actually means to tie back, right? Or to turn back and tie yourself to what really matters, or something like that. And one of the ways that we make use of being tied back to the sacred, or tied back to the gods, is that we ask them as ancestors, as benefactors, whatever, to give us a glimpse into what the future may hold. Now, here, what you see is a hexagram called the I Ching, and this is actually a means of divination in ancient China that was slowly but surely incorporated into a lot of Chinese tradition. So you still find people doing this kind of thing today. In the old days, they might have sacrificed animals, or they might have observed the flights of birds. That was actually, observing the flight of birds was very important to the Romans. And they had whole books that they constructed to to attempt to see if they could record the different kinds of events that happened around the time of certain bird migrations or the observation of certain kinds of birds in and out of the city. So, this went on for centuries. And actually, one person said that what mattered in Rome, what made a Roman, is that they held up the auguries and the Senate as the cornerstones of the Roman civilization, right? So the auguries, examining the sacrificed animals' entrails and observing the flights of birds and making castings of certain divinations, all were on and actually come before and are just as important as the Senate. And we should remember that for the ancient Romans, the Senate itself was a sacred body. Like, violence couldn't happen in the Senate. It was a sacred space. So they developed all these divinations, and almost every culture has done this, and we've done it. Even in a society that claims to be as Christian, quote-unquote Christian, or as influenced by the Abrahamic religion of Christianity as the United States pretends to be, people do this kind of divination thing all the time. I've seen, very, very rigorous fundamentalist Christians open a Bible at random and utilize whatever passage they first read on to help them figure out. This is something called bibliomancy, to help them figure out what they should do next in their life, right? And we all develop little rituals like, I can remember as a child when I'd be anxious waiting for my father to pick me up, I'd be like, okay, I'm going to count 10 cars, and the 11th car will be my father. That's not so much divination. That's moving in the direction of trying to control the world. We'll get to that in a little bit. But the point is that, you kind of look around you and you try to divine what's about to happen for whatever reason. We want to know. We may be forgetful, but the past is something we can explore. Like I was just saying, we don't know that much about the practice of Dionysian cult worship. I don't know if y'all can hear that thunder in the background. We don't know about the Dionysian cult worship, but we can put two and two together, and we can work on figuring out a great deal about it by sort of retracing and rethinking. So, when we're in the process of doing something like trying to figure out how important divination is, we'll be able to figure out whether a religion has a lot of divinatory or attempts to divine a future that's not sure. So, we can look backward with a lot of surety and even figure things out, but looking forward, we really don't know what's going to happen outside of the first few days after us, right? So the farther you get away from yourself in time, the less surety there is. And if you live in a society that begins to fetishize security for whatever reason, then it becomes very important to kind of get an idea of where you're going or what's about to happen. Mind you, I'm not saying that, divination is real or efficacious. I'm saying why human beings get into divination. Usually there will be some sort of shamanic or prophetic element in a religion. So shamans basically, that's actually a literal word taken from Siberian indigenous people, and then it's been utilized by scholars for the last 130 years or so to talk about indigenous priests or magicians inside of classical cultures or something like that. And of course, you probably are familiar with the idea of a prophet. You got to remember, when you're talking about a shaman, you're talking about someone in a sense who speaks for nature and tradition. And when you're talking about a prophet, you're talking about someone who speaks for God and tradition. And sometimes prophets are predictors and diviners because they see the writing on the wall and they've been given hints by the divine. Shamans are also can be predictors and diviners. because they see what's written in nature. A lot of times people will develop totems, a people will develop totems that demonstrate kinship or demonstrate, to whom a people or a family is dedicated, and who it respects. So we'll get a lot of, in these first two lookings, so this introduction to religion is getting you ready for the basis. In the chapter 2, when we look at Native American or First Nation traditions, chapter 3, when we look at African traditions, we'll see what people more commonly call totems. But we have to remember that totems are actually just all around us. A flag of the United States, Old Glory, is a totem. The way some people treat the Bible is a totem. The Rolls Royce or the Mercedes or the Lamborghini emblems are totems, right? They're totems of success. So this totemism kind of stays alive. One of the things that you obviously are probably beginning to get now is that whatever you can lie at the feet of quote unquote primitive or quote unquote first peoples, and whatever you can lie at the feet of quote unquote ancient dead religions, it's all still practiced. Humans have not stopped doing the majority of these things. We still do them, and they've sometimes gotten a great deal of sedimented gilding on top of them, so you don't look at a cross and say, "Oh, that's a totem of my fetish," or you don't look at Old Glory and say, "That's a totem of my fetish." But in actuality, that's what they are, right? Because you put a lot of spiritual potence in these symbols. Right. This picture here actually is a picture of a voodoo loa, and it's I think it's quite beautiful. If you ever have a chance to actually study Santeria or Voodoo or anything like that, hopefully you'll take this opportunity in this class maybe to dip into it a little bit. You see, it's actually a very interesting and beautiful, either of them, they're both two different traditions, they're very beautiful worships. Also one that I think is really kind of on the uptick now for the last 50 years is the cult of Santa Muerte, or Holy Death, the Angel of Holy Death, which you see in the southern United States and Mexico and Central America a great deal. Okay. So one of the things that occurs in most religions as well is this idea of sacrifice. Now, you look at this word sacrifice, and it means to make holy, right? To sacrifice means to make holy. It's probably one of the most common of all the practices that you see everywhere. And it doesn't have to be a blood sacrifice. It doesn't have to be the sacrifice of something that has been alive and it's not anymore, like, cut a plant or something like that. But basically, it is about giving something up, right? And the word victim, which gets thrown around in our culture a lot as people either get lost to a certain kind of victimization, or other people try to silence folks that are pointing out real problems by saying they have a victim mentality. A victim used to only be something that was sacrificed. So when you talk about this notion of victim, you talk about someone who's been made holy, but for the benefit of someone else, right? So you can make sacrifices of spirits, and you can make sacrifices to spirits, animals, nature, or the ancestors, uh, and you want to give up something of value. So a long time ago, sacrifices could be anything from your best cow to your first child to the heart of an enemy. These kinds of really kind of bloody things. But nowadays, it's interesting how the word sacrifice gets done. People will say this person died, fighting this battle. They gave the ultimate sacrifice, which means they gave the item of most value to themselves, their life, for the sake of whatever cause they were serving, or whatever, whether it was just helping their friends in the platoon, or it was, for mom and apple pie, or what it was, for making sure that America has totally every advantage it possibly can have. Whatever the idea is, when a person makes the ultimate sacrifice in that way, giving themselves up for the benefit of the world after they're gone, right? They're made holy, but technically they're a victim. They're a victim of sacrifice. They might have sacrificed themselves, but that actually makes them technically a victim. So it's an interesting, just studying in this course should give you new insights into the way certain words and certain ideas are being thrown around by different parties in our culture and kind of twisted to make their side look like it's more holy or more sacred than it may be. Okay. Magic is really cool because magic is actually the means by which we attempt to control nature or control the world. Some philosophers in the 18th century actually began to make the argument that praying itself is an act of magic because you're trying to control the deity. So therefore, there's something not quite right about it. And so let's think about what this magic is. Magic is not the same thing as religion, and not all religions have a place for magic. Magic actually is an attempt to use your will and action to control the force of nature, to bend the will of the gods, to sort of create some shortcut around the fact that you use the magic and the magical formulas and rituals and items to boost yourself. So you'd actually be aware of this if you've played any AD&D or any kind of video games, Dungeons and Dragons, or any kind of video games that are multiple player, where you have to find magical items that will help you jump across a ravine that you wouldn't normally be able to get across. I think it's really awesome, all these thunder cracks going on in the background while I talk about this stuff. Anyway, so you have to get that magical item and utilize it. But interestingly enough as well, you have to, it's getting kind of crazy. You have to also see that magic then is about a trick. So on the one hand, what we call magic in the everyday world is a trick. It's like the way that you trick people. And that trick, can often be quite mind-boggling because it's a sleight of hand, prestidigitation, as they say, that allows for you to understand that you're. Let's start over. God damn it.